Hello, this is Mr. Pillsbury here trying to introduce to you guys the timeline of World War II in a visual diagram. So we're going to start with the German theater because there's two theaters we're primarily concerned with during World War II, and that's going to be the European theater as well as the Pacific theater. So we're going to get right into it. You can see I have my PowerPoint on the left, and then I'm going to be going over the answers on the right. The essential question for this is, why do political actions often lead to war? And so we're going to hopefully answer some of that as we go through this, but we're going to get right into it with the causes of the German path to war. So the first cause to the German path to war is going to be the rearming of Germany. This will violate the Treaty of Versailles, as Germany will add 550,000 troops to their military in 1935. And they will also send troops to the Rhineland, which was absolutely illegal and will violate the Treaty of Versailles. Germany will also be annexing Austria, which they will, want back this land that they had to give up during World War I. So in 1938, it was called Anschluss, and Anschluss is the inclusion of this Austria into Germany, and so that's the number two reason why we're talking about the causes of the German path to war. And number three will be the appeasement of England and France, as England and France tried to appease Hitler by giving him a chunk of land, which would be called the Sudetenland, at the Munich conference. And of course, this does not appease Hitler, who was definitely wanting more land at that particular time. We're going to keep going along our timeline here. I'm going to go through some of the slides as we go into this. One of the things that happens prior to some of these things that I just discussed was the World Depression with 25% unemployment rate, and that's going to really set the stage for what they're going to be experiencing during this time period and makes these other governments look more appealing, such as fascism and communism. I always talk about the word gradualism, and that is meaning, why didn't people get out of Germany? Why didn't, people know this was coming? Why didn't they read his book? A lot of it has to do with the fact that this was a gradual situation, that over time this was taking place, and that's why people didn't realize it. And, it's very much like what we're experiencing with the coronavirus. A couple of weeks ago, we were in school. We were fine. China was dealing with this, but then all of a sudden it just kind of like hit us. And we went, in a time of about a week, we went to lockdown, which was totally crazy. So here's kind of the things I already went over, what will cause the German path to war. And let's keep moving. There's Hitler, of course, because we already covered that. So Germany annexes Austria in 1938. We already discussed that briefly. Austria was once a part of Germany, as the people there speak German. Hitler is German, as we learned about in the previous unit. So also the Hitler will sign what's called the Munich Agreement with Great Britain and France, and I have a picture of a dog bone here because you can see this little section of land. That's called the Sudetenland right here, and so that little section is what they gave him. And so it was almost impossible to appease Hitler at this particular time. Hitler's next victim on his list is going to be Czechoslovakia, which is going to happen in 1938. Most of these countries were not prepared for the type of war that he was bringing to them, which is a very violent war, is a very mechanized war, is a very modern war, and obviously appeasement will not work. And so that's kind of one of the things that you want to keep in mind as we look at this time period in history. I think we're going to just take a break and go over here to the next box, which talks about the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. So why did Hitler and Stalin sign a pact with each other? And this deals with, number one, fear. Hitler feared that the West and the Soviets would make an alliance, which eventually they will, the West being the United States, Great Britain, and France. And so they will eventually make that alliance, which will actually push Hitler out of France. Number two, this pact, Hitler did make a pact with Stalin, and they promised not to attack each other. They both were very paranoid men. They were both very scared of one another, and so they figured we might as well negotiate with one another. And to get signed on the pact, he gave Stalin control of the eastern section of Poland and the Baltic states. And the quote says, "Now Poland is in the position in which I wanted her. I'm only afraid that at the last moment some swine will yet submit to me a plan for mediation." And so, Stalin is just as brutal, if not more brutal, than Hitler on this thing. So let's keep going. And obviously you can see the picture of them two together, signing their pact together. Blitzkrieg refers to the style of warfare fought by Hitler. I have it on the diagram here. It's already filled in for you. It's called lightning warfare. It's very quick. It's very, it's obviously got a lot of support using planes and tanks and other things like that. And a lot of countries will fall because of that lightning attack of warfare. This kind of just goes through Germany invading Denmark. And let's go over here. This is 1939 in Norway. So he will attack them next. You can see he's just going to go on an absolute, terror going through Europe and attacking all these different countries. Let's keep going, because we want to get to the Battle of Britain. 1939, September 1st, Hitler will invade Poland, bringing France and Great Britain into the war. This is when the war kind of officially begins, according to some historians. He will conquer them in 3 weeks, and he splits that with Stalin, which we already kind of discussed. On March 1940, we're going to sign what's called the Land-Lease Act, which was a program in which the United States promised to supply goods and war material to Great Britain. They basically didn't pay back the $50 billion that we sent them because they couldn't pay us back, and they only actually paid $650 million of that back. And you can see FDR here signing that agreement. So it's a Lend-Lease Act. Remember, we were not in the war in March 1940, and so that's kind of one of the reasons why we prefer to Lend-Lease Act that stuff to Great Britain than actually be involved in the war. Another thing that takes place is called the Miracle of Dunkirk. This would be a British evacuation in France. So in France at that particular time, there was a lot of British men and women who were either military or otherwise. And so what they did is this small city, as the Germans started kind of clamping down on France, they basically used these small boats. You can see in the picture, there's a good movie called Dunkirk that's out that's really shows what's going on with this. But basically, they took these men and they moved them back and forth all across the channel for 9 days, and it was quite the miracle, but they actually managed to do it. And the channel's 35 miles, which basically is the same amount of space as us going to Catalina. So you can imagine how difficult that would be to do that. June 1940, Germany will occupy France. They take France in 6 weeks. France had what's called their Maginot Line. Their Maginot Line was a bunch of pillboxes like this. They had guns in place. They were fixed. They were not movable. And they thought this would actually prevent that from taking place. But obviously, they're completely wrong about that. And that leads us to the Battle of Britain, which I'm going to go over here and talk about on the diagram, because that's the next thing. This is an amphibious invasion of Britain, and it only will succeed if the German controlled the air. So they didn't actually attack Great Britain on the land. They only had an air battle. And so the Luftwaffe would go up against the British Air Force, or the RAF, and they will lose. And so in the Battle of Britain, this is an incredible victory for the British, as they will win. You can see some of the things that was going on here. Germany and Hitler, in their frustration, will drop 190,000 tons of bombs on London. And luckily, the British had some serious technology that kind of came out of this that allowed them to be victorious. One was the radar, and another one was the Enigma. The Enigma allowed them to know where the Germans were attacking before they actually attacked. So you can see the totals there on all that, the slide about that. So let's keep going. I'm going to go down over here, and we're going to talk about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is something that's going to take place during this time period where Hitler's going to exterminate the Jews. He blamed them for the loss of World War I, and this would be called a genocide. It's brutal. We're going to spend some time on that later. As we move forward, one of the things that's going to take place is this battle for the Atlantic. So you've got that giant ocean there, and who's going to control it? Is it going to be the Germans, or is it going to be the Allies? And you can see the number of sinking of all these ships as the United States was sending over materials, and without those materials, the Europeans would not be successful. And so what we knew that we needed to create some sort of way to understand what they were doing and where they were at. And so we did that through radar and through the use of the Enigma, which told us the locations of some of their subs. And so we actually won the Battle of Atlantic. That would be the Allies. I believe that actually turn the tide of the war. Another part that was kind of pivotal in this is number 2 would be North Africa. The goal was to push the Italians out of Africa. This is our first real venture in Europe, and you can see what was going on here. Italy was in charge of this with Mussolini. He was in charge of taking control of Africa, but luckily the United States managed to go over there, and we actually will do a great job at getting the Italians pushed back to Italy, and this will be a practice run for D-Day, which is coming up shortly here. So you guys can read more of this stuff on your own. Here's General Rommel. He was the general in charge, the German general in charge of the advance, and he basically was an incredible general. He did a great job. Unfortunately for him, the British commander Montgomery stopped him, and this will allow him to, he'll lose. And so that was very frustrating for Hitler because he didn't like losing. Now, we had a general called General Eisenhower. Before we get to the Russian front, General Eisenhower was put in charge of Africa. He will also be in charge of D-Day, which would be the European invasion, which pushed the Germans out of France and back to Europe. And as we move forward on this thing, the United States is still not in the war because we don't get in the war until Pearl Harbor takes place. There's going to be a tripartite agreement between Japan, Italy, and Germany. These are the evil countries involved that are doing all these bad things. I do want to speak for a moment about the Russian front. The Russian front this is our third box on the bottom. The Russian front is going to be an invasion by Hitler. He gets very frustrated with his loss to England, and he opens up what's called the Operation Barbarossa. Barbarossa is where the Russians will lose 2.5 million people defending their country. Because they have General Winter on their side, or Winter, they can just backpedal and burn everything so there's no crops. And so there is negative 20-degree weather within Russia, which basically will decimate the German troops. And you can see what's going on here with some of the statistics with this as Operation Barbarossa. And then we're going to get to our last slide, which hopefully I'm not going too fast as I'm just introing this. After Operation Barbarossa, we have the Battle of Stalingrad that happens in 1942. Hitler will lose 300,000 men. Him going up against Stalin was a paranoid response. He also had to decide whether he was to pursue the Holocaust or if he was going to pursue more fighting against Russia. He decided to pursue both, and he will lose the Battle of Stalingrad, and this will be a huge disappointment for him. As we move forward, in Europe, the last real battle is called the D-Day to Berlin on June 6, 1944. We will invade D-Day. My grandfather was actually there. Later in the day, he wasn't there in the morning, but it was still brutal and there were still snipers around. But we took 176,000 troops and landed them at Normandy Beach in France, and this is the beginning of pushing those Germans out of France. There were so many layers and levels to this that I'd love to answer any of your questions that you have about this, because it's very, very complex and complicated and lots and lots going on here. I'm going to show you the slide. D-Day to Berlin. They called it Operation Overlord. There was 5 beaches in Normandy. This will eventually lead us to the Battle of the Bulge, which is the kind of last offensive by the Germans. This is a brutal battle in which the Germans lost 250,000 people, where the United States lost 80,000 people in this brutal battle. Most of these battles were hedgerow fightings as we moved our way across Europe to eventually push the Germans out of Europe and get them back to their country where we could attack them in Berlin and take down Hitler. This is a picture of the D-Day invasion as we would start in England and move our way there in the morning. There's D-Day, or Eisenhower kind of getting the troops fired up because they didn't even know about this till the last second. And eventually we will liberate Paris in August of 1944. This is more about this. This is more about Auschwitz and Poland, which we'll get into next week. I just want to make this a little bit shorter here because of time. So hopefully you enjoyed it.